Welcome back to another edition of Establish the Edge. You check this out on iTunes for the podcast version. If you want to watch the video feed, you can go over to the Establish the Run YouTube channel. Like us, subscribe us, helps us keep doing these podcasts and these videos for YouTube for free. And really excited for today's podcast. It's going to be a dynasty theme. And I brought in Shawn Siegele of RotoViz. And we're going to be talking about strategy around quarterbacks in SuperFlex 2-quarterback dynasty league. So Shawn, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks for having me. Quarterbacks and Superflex. I mean, that's really where it's at now. One of the things that I love about Superflex, it just brings so many more tactics into play. And I think that if you are excited about your player evaluation, if you like your tactics, you want there to be as much complication as possible in the format you're playing. Superflex and Deep Superflex formats bring that in. And just kind of reading through the questions that you sent me, there's just so much to think about. It's such a cool topic. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And speaking of format, like right off the bat, I'm kind of curious how format affects the way you think about it. I know we're in a league together, our auction Superflex league, where we start a lot of players. So you have the quarterback and the super flex, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end. But then we've also got, I think, 4 other flex spots. So you're starting, 10 to 11 guys. Even if you take out the 2 quarterbacks, let's say it's 8 other skill players that you're starting. And I was in one of these leagues a few years ago. And my inclination would be that quarterbacks would be overvalued going into a startup draft. And this was a snake draft just because this scarcity at the other positions when you're in a really deep league starts to matter a little bit more. And I think people think about the positional scarcity at quarterback a lot more than the other positions, even though it gets deeper with that flex. Now, of course, what happened in that draft is I think everybody went in thinking people would overvalue quarterback, and the quarterback slipped so much. And just as a side, dynasty gets kind of crazy. The more years you experience, you just get better at it, just kind of seeing how things unfold. But I'm kicking myself in that draft for not taking quarterbacks earlier. But of course, there's differences if you're playing in that format versus maybe a more traditional, slimmer roster where it's just like 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, a quarterback, and a flex. And in that case, you're starting, 6 skill players versus 8. So how does that impact? Does it impact at all where you have quarterbacks, on your draft board?
It does a lot. And you mentioned the best ball element. With that, and especially if you're not having in-season waivers, which most best ball formats don't necessarily have. I mean, you have to have that third QB. You want to have 3 elite QBs. You want to benefit from the optimization there. And having the 3 studs also will create more scarcity, obviously, for the other teams. And so if you do put yourself in the right position there, it makes it a lot more difficult for everybody else. And so thinking about this auction that you mentioned, I was a little bit surprised that the prices weren't higher, kind of as you say. Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, both very inexpensive compared to where I had them projected. A lot different even than a couple years later, what the sort of corresponding prices would be right now in startups. And then
this was 2 years ago, just for context, on the Watson and Kyler prices.
And then I also added Carson Wentz, speaking of a couple of years ago, before the meltdown, paid our buddy Pat Kerrane quite a bit in terms of future picks to make sure I had that third QB once it looked like the team was going to be very competitive right from the start. So you have those different elements. I'm going to point out one of the risks of going about it like that later, but I think that in best ball, you need to be powerful at the QB position. In a shorter starting lineup league, you also need to be powerful because that super flex becomes just such a big part of the lineup. It's going to be harder to replace that with your depth. And just you need to maximize the starting points. One of the things that I have to always remind myself is just how big the difference is between the normal FFPC Superflex format and the RotoViz Triflex format that they also host. It's just dramatically different in terms of the percentage of the points that Superflex position is going to give you. You don't want to let yourself get in big trouble there. And you might make some concessions in a startup or via trade that you wouldn't otherwise. Whereas I like to play it pretty aggressively in terms of taking risks in the deeper starting lineup formats, the triflex format, some of the things that I've done with you and some other experts. In those cases, I think it's important to think about it a little bit the way that I've always encouraged people to think about the running back position, where it's important to not chase points. If you get yourself in this situation where you're drafting in the back half or the turn, and you're really looking at options that aren't particularly appealing, but you think to yourself, if I don't make the move here, I'm just going to get further behind. I would prefer to put pressure on the rest of the league in terms of having elite production from other positions and trust myself to make moves, whether it's good picks later in the draft, whether it's trades in the draft or trades later, to shore up some of those positions. You can get away with that more. And even just completely fading the QB position is possible if you have a deep enough starting lineup. In those other formats, that's not really possible.
Yeah, if you're to compare, in a managed regular FFPC Dynasty league, I believe you're starting 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, and 1 super flex. So you're maxing out at 3 wide receivers, assuming you're starting 2 quarterbacks every week, which you want to. So really high percentage of the points coming from the quarterback position. And if it's managed, those points are a lot more predictable. If you're in best ball, you could maybe get wide receivers sneaking in there just based on random spike week variants. So it's really different. I'm in one of those. I'm also in a startup that I just did with Drew Dinkmeyer, which is the RotoViz Triflex version. And we want to start 5 wide receivers a week in that one, even with starting 2 quarterbacks. We can do that. So we kind of went hero quarterback, and we did go against your advice a little bit at the turn where we had pick 11. And I've been tilting my FFPC Dynasty startup spots the last 2 years. I feel like I haven't picked earlier than like 9th, which has been tilting. I was in one where I picked 10th, and I did a podcast on this earlier this offseason, and I traded out, thought I got some good value. And then Kyler and Lamar somehow slipped, and I couldn't trade back up, and it was a disaster, Shawn. So was more patient this time. And of course, at 11, did not get the Kyler Lamar slippage. We took Dak Prescott because we really wanted to get one quarterback, especially with it being managed. I don't know. We just felt like we wanted to lock in one of those guys, and we didn't have a skill player that we loved. We would have been happy with Kyle Pitts, but he went. And then obviously Chase and Jefferson were gone. I was surprised to see the RotoViz rankings. You guys are pretty low on Dak, even in the SuperFlex format. So I was curious, what you would do at 11, which it sounds like you would go skill player and kind of start that pressure on other teams, and why you have Dak down kind of in an undraftable range in your rankings.
Yeah, I was kind of looking at the rankings, and I do need to move him up a couple of spots. Definitely needs to be above Russell Wilson. But when I look at him and I look at the position players or the other skill players available there too, I feel like I'm not really down on him so much as I don't feel like quarterback is of value at that point. And so you mentioned the 111. That's absolutely brutal. Ben Gretchen and I had a chance to select Lamar Jackson 111 in one of ours, and did decide to trade back still. I think, and it really depends again on your league. Some leagues, a lot of trading is very, very viable. In some leagues, you're going to be forced to sit there and make your selection. I think you have to relentlessly trade back through all of that range, especially once the elite QBs are gone. You mentioned, it's just so frustrating to get that pick. And one of the things that we love about Superflex is it does balance out the first round. It makes it more equal. And yet when you see the trades that managers who get the 101 to 103, 104, the prices that people are paying to get up there, you're like, I've already lost because, someone who had the top 4 pick has already added like multiple first round picks in the future just to move down like 5 spots. So that part is tricky, but it still is a lot better than if we weren't playing with the Superflex. I like that part of it. And Prescott is in this age range where there's still a lot potentially to go, but he doesn't have those years from, say, 25 to 29. He's going to be in his age 29 season, and that introduces a variety of risks. One of the things that I talk about a lot with Dynasty is that any player that you pick, you want to be able to select or acquire in a trade, play for 2 years, and then trade at peak trade value. which really forces you to go very, very young, especially at the other positions. At quarterback, obviously, you can go older because you're expecting those guys to have more longevity. But we still get in this situation where if Prescott gets into his early 30s and has a bad season or has another little bit of an injury, doesn't add that rushing production back, then suddenly the trade value really falls. And so I'm almost more concerned about him from a future trade value perspective than what will he do the next couple of seasons, because his ADP in redraft in that QB7 to QB9 type of range looks very, very justified. And I think that he makes a lot of sense in that format. For Dynasty, I just think it's a little bit trickier because a lot of things really have to happen right for him in terms of touchdown rate, in terms of throwing a lot of passes, hopefully CeeDee Lamb emerging as a superstar for him to really realize what seems like very possible value there kind of at the 1-2 turn.
Yeah, and to your point, if you can trade out, especially if you miss out on those top quarterbacks, it's worth doing so. We had a guy in our league who we estimated started with 2 2023 first-round picks ahead of us just by starting in the 102 spot, traded down to the 109 for a 2023 first, and then traded back just a little bit more to swap a second for a first. And we felt pretty behind. So the depth that's required when you're in the RotoViz TriFlex and those deeper type leagues, I think is undervalued. When you're in the 10th round and you're drafting guys that are still starters for you, that's a very real pressure on your team because there's going to be injuries, there's going to be busts. So now you're talking really important picks in rounds 11 through 14. So it can get dicey. So if you can pick up even more picks in the middle rounds or bank some value in terms of future picks, I think that makes a lot of sense, even though it can be tough to pass on those top quarterbacks. Circling back to the auction we did, you started with Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson. In general, I guess where's the line between wanting to start with those stud quarterbacks versus getting in a spot like I'm in where you got to trade down? Are you just kind of feeling out the market of each league individually? Is there a preferred structure you'd like to have at quarterback? I know I've done some leagues where I've done like real patchwork at quarterback. Like in this auction we did, I went pretty patchwork, and that allowed me to build a really strong team around quarterback because I wasn't overpaying at quarterback at all. And I was it's making up for quality with quantity a little bit. But you fast forward 2 years and I had to start my rebuild because the quarterback position got so shaky. Guys like Matt Ryan and whatnot were, I had Drew Lock on the team. I at one point had like 6 starting quarterbacks, a year and a half ago, and I was down to like 1 this year. So there's some short-term upside there, but long-term it gets dicey. So just wrapping all that together, like your preferred construction at quarterback and how much the market dictates that.
And that's one of the great things about, again, sort of the SuperFlex compared to everything else, where you will have individual leagues that are so aggressive at QB. You'll also have some where everyone is looking at each other and saying, I'm going to draft the last guys from each tier. And I feel like I can make the move to get back in there through trades or simply by making sure I'm very disciplined with my picks. I've been in expert drafts, and you see this a little bit more with expert drafts, where the guys will really fall. And then if you took, especially someone who's not one of those top 5 or 6 guys in that first to second round range, then you feel silly later because the value you could get in round 4, 5, 6, 7 is extremely positive. And so you want to make sure that you're working within your particular league, even much more than other formats. I love what you said about patchwork, though, because I think that SuperFlex Dynasty really lends itself to that, where you can build your team with a variety of quarterbacks. And I mean, I almost like to have a lot of different profiles. And over time, I think you can build up to where you have these different profiles to where you have 5 or 6 QBs. So when I'm starting out in the first couple of rounds, I'm looking to sell, move back, build depth, build the other positions. But then just constantly throughout from that point, you're looking for any opportunity to pick up a QB. And so, I mean, I'd love to leave the draft, but certainly leave like the second year as things develop within the context of the first 18 months of your league, to where you've got a star QB, you've got a breakout QB, you've got a bounce back QB, you've got some veteran filler. And one of the things that you kind of mentioned, I think is going to be tricky when you're trying to make moves with the types of people that you put together for that auction. But you want to be continually churning even those kind of bottom guys. And so every time that you move a quarterback away, you get some quarterbacks in, and you're just trying to turn over the players like a Jimmy Garoppolo. And it's not always possible. I've got leagues where Jimmy Garoppolo was a starter for me last year. You can't move him. And now you're looking at different things that you have to do, different scenarios based on that to make this year work. But one of the things that I also do see in these startups is that because managers went so aggressively after the quarterbacks in the first 3 rounds, then they feel a lot of pressure to fill in the rest of that lineup. And so when you get deeper, a lot of quarterbacks will fall to you again in specific drafts. I had a startup last season where we ended up moving down. Then we took Trevor Lawrence, which was a disaster. And then you get into those kind of late middle rounds and drafted Brady, Carr, Garoppolo, Mac Jones. And even with Lawrence being a disaster, the rest of that works out very, very well. And to the point where certain managers will come to you and ask you why you're picking so many quarterbacks. And like, the quarterbacks are clearly the value here. You're going to be able to move out of them. That was a league where he traded Garoppolo. You get fortunate because Brady decides to come back. But even without Lawrence playing there, you now have a 3 quarterback situation where you have Brady, Carr, and Mac Jones, who could actually be the star from this class. And then obviously Trevor Lawrence's ADP and his trade value, because of who he was when he came in and because of, this hope for the second year leap, it's still very, very good. So you can get back out of some of those guys.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And it's hard for, I'm still like evolving what I want to do in these startups, because again, each league is different, of course, but I've seen the success you can have with the patchwork quarterback. I won a TriFlex startup last year, basically trading down a gazillion times, having just absurd wide receiver depth and upside. And I think I ended up starting, my 3 quarterbacks were Zach Wilson, Mac Jones, and Ben Roethlisberger. So it was like able to make it work because you're starting you're starting 5 wide receivers a week. But of course, I've got a retired quarterback now on my squad. I don't have a good rookie pick, and I need to somehow figure out how to get a quarterback. So that's a problem. And I've just had a hard time weighing like that short-term upside with, if you're in a league where quarterbacks are overvalued in the startup, but like you're still taking on a lot of fragility and risk, even though you might be getting a ton of value by eschewing the top quarterbacks in those types of leagues. And then I'm wrapping my head around someone like Mahomes, even, who, some of his value is in the fact that you're not going to have to replace him for 10 years. We can't even think in those time frames at other positions. But like, what's the best way to realize that value with a Mahomes team if you're kind of like overpaying a little bit up front to get that value on the back end? And those are the types of things I'm trying to think through. We had a really interesting trade in this auction league we've been talking about, again, which is deep starting rosters, where Davis Maddock essentially started with a full rebuild, like just for fun in the startup auction, just traded for his dollars away for future picks. And the one guy he spent on was Mahomes, with the idea that he's just going to hold value. And I didn't think Davis would have the gall to trade him, but I think he needed to get the depth required to win this type of league. He trades him to Ben. So essentially the trade was Mahomes and Noah Fant for Elijah Moore, Jamison Williams, and then Ben's 2023 first through third rounds. And it seems like a pretty fair trade to me. I think someone on the outside might see this as a little bit light for Mahomes, but when you understand the depth required in this league, it seems pretty even. But I'm just wondering, like, is Ben giving up that depth in this type of league? Like, when's he going to be able to capitalize on having Mahomes, even though I think like the value he traded made a ton of sense?
Yeah, I think with a huge trade like that, you need to be in position to win right now and take advantage of some of these theoretically peak seasons. But I think now is the time to buy Mahomes because there is uncertainty around his targets. I actually think it's going to be an upgrade. I'm probably in a little bit of a minority there, at least based on what we're seeing with ADPs in multiple formats. But even if it's a mild downgrade, this is a great time to buy, but it does need to make sense for you where you buy and win, and then you can trade him again for just a huge package in a couple of years, or you're sort of in it for the long haul and you're willing to take that risk. I had a dispersal auction a couple of years ago where I started with Mahomes because in that particular format, the QBs are just impossible to get, and the studs really will carry you, even with sort of a deep starting lineup. But I'm in a position where, a couple of years in, I'm going to have like 21 Devy players as part of my 40-man roster for this season. So it is a long build, and that kind of thing comes into play. The other element, just with attacking these top QBs, it can put you in a great position, but it also exposes you to risk. And one of the things that I thought was going to happen in our league was that Murray and Watson and Wentz would really be this dynamic, just almost obliterating factor to where the depth and the youth and the rest of the positions would make it so the team ascended and would be almost unbeatable for a several year time period. But then one of the things that you have happen is, we tend to think in terms of injury risk, but we do know that just like normal people, NFL players will occasionally do things that maybe they regret later. And so you have, you miss a year, you have potential suspension beyond that. And even beyond injury risk for guys who were playing at an almost MVP level. And, Carson Wentz is just such an odd duck. We won't go into him too much, but you have the collapse risk, right? And so when you have put so much of your team, and I was fortunate enough that there was depth, but you can get into situations where it's just impossible to do. Curtis Patrick and I drafted this team in the normal FFPC format a couple of years ago, where through a variety of trades, we ended up with 4 top 10 players like during the startup. So we had Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Michael Thomas, and Dak Prescott. And you can kind of guess how that story went. Those guys all get hurt, and the team not only isn't dominating, but it's bad. And one of the things that I like with the patchwork QB, with the relentlessly trading down, is that you build this team that is almost unbeatable and just doesn't have that much risk to it. One of the leagues that I won last year with maybe one of the top 2 or 3 roster of opposing managers was a league where I had Jimmy Garoppolo and Taylor Heinicke as the guys who were starting, if I indeed even decided to use a second quarterback in the SuperFlex position. But because, and a little bit, I think it must be like what you described for your team, where the firepower at wide receiver, at running back, at tight end is so great that I ended up winning the league, even though I was sort of pointing for a year in the future where hopefully I'd be able to turn some of those guys into quarterbacks. And if you have a deep enough starting lineup requirement in your format, I really like that way, especially then when you get in circumstances like this year where, I could end up being completely wrong on this, but just from a sort of a contingency-based perspective, or looking through how things could break in your favor, you're going to get some of these years, and everybody's lamenting the fact that this quarterback class was so bad. But the flip side of that is you have these profiles where if those guys actually got to play, they wouldn't necessarily even have to be that good to score points.
Yeah.
And so you can very inexpensively add those guys to your roster. And again, in terms of risk management, it's a great situation to be in. If they hit, you're golden. If they don't, it doesn't really change what you're doing any.
Yeah, I've taken a lot of Corral and Ritter kind of end around 2 in rookie drafts. I think that makes a lot of sense. I have kind of a real life example of some of the stuff that you were talking about there in terms of being able to trade out of depth at other positions if you're in a deeper league. And I'm curious what you think as far as how much risk to take in the quarterback position and how long-term to think versus short-term. So I had a team that is pretty loaded going into the year. I had Hurts and Tua as my only 2 quarterbacks though. So it's a managed league, not a best ball league, managed league. So without a ton of investment in quarterback and hitting on Hurts a little bit, like my short-term upside, really, really high. But short-term risk is pretty high, and like a year out, I mean, it's possible both those guys don't have jobs in a year. I mean, maybe not likely, but it's on the table. And I was starting with Swift as my one running back, and I'm just like loaded at wide receiver. And it's one of those leagues where it's not one of the ones we're in where we all value wide receivers at a much higher rate than running backs. So as a result, every step of the way, I'm kind of digging in at wide receiver because I'm valuing wide receiver more than the market is valuing wide receiver. So long story short, I end up trading Tua and Jamar Chase, who I never thought I would trade, for Lamar Jackson and Devonta Smith. And my thought process there was, I think my total point output doesn't change a whole ton, but I've kind of shifted some of the risk from the quarterback position and spread it out a little bit. So I'm a little bit more stable at quarterback. I think I'm a pretty big Lamar guy. So just kind of curious, like what you think of a trade like that. And also in terms of when you're not aligned with market values, you at a certain point, you have to play the game, I guess. You know, I can only, it's a managed league. I can only start 4 wide receivers a week. I have AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb, DJ Moore, Rondale Moore, like a bunch of guys. Just like, how do you view, there's an edge if you're different from the market. You need to be different than the market to have an edge. But if you get too far away from the market, it becomes tough to actually realize your edge.
Yeah, I like that move. Although, as you mentioned,
I know Chase. I know. It was so painful, but
he's sort of the one guy, and Jefferson probably in this category as well. But to where I do think that their value is in that same QB range with the top guys. And you mentioned that when you guys picked Dak, that both of those players were gone, and you know it makes sense to move back to looking at quarterback at that point. Being different than the market is always very interesting, and I do get questions frequently about why I'm so far off on this player or that player. And most of the time, my response on those questions will just be, well, I mean, obviously you're going to miss him even if I move him up. So let's not worry too much if I'm, off by that margin. But the thing I love about SuperFlex is just there are so many different ways to do it. And so you can move in a triangle. You can get, 3-way trades. They're not actually 3-way trades, but you work consecutively with those. I also think that there's an element where the patience part of it in Dynasty is fun. I mentioned that league where I have 2 quarterbacks, probably neither one will start next year. And so I may have to actually make some trade. I do get a lot of offers in for Chase, but then the patience element of it, you can look through and try and figure out who you'd be willing to get rid of. One of the things, and again, this kind of goes back to this idea of how do you manage to move the players before that trade value goes to almost zero, even though the actual production is fantastic. I have Dalvin Cook in that league, and you can't move him for something that matters. And so you're looking at a situation where you may ride him to zero. At the same time, maybe a QB trade will materialize for somebody who else is also in the win now window. And so by virtue of actually having this championship window that is so vast because your lineup is so deep and has so many young players, and also isn't going to be damaged by even career-ending injuries to 2 or 3 guys. I mean, you're hoping that obviously doesn't happen. But if you have depth to the point of really having like 20 to 25 top 10, first 10 rounds startup value players, even a couple of injuries aren't going to hurt you. And so I continue to try and use that patience, talk with the different managers in the league, and just continually work to see what you can get. Because one of the problems that you will have is if you don't have starting quarterbacks in a super flex league, the offers you get will be very aggressive because they know that you need to start somebody. I think you have to be willing to kind of fight through that and wait for the next opportunity to come. The thing that's so great about having a permanent championship window is that if you have to take a year off in the midst of this run where you have buys, you could do that. And I sort of prefer that as opposed to just having to pay a huge price for some quarterbacks. One of the other things that happened, and one of the things that happened with Heineke, and that you can kind of get by with in managed leagues, even though it's not ideal. One of the things that You also mentioned to me as we were kind of discussing the show is that the elite quarterback scoring is not only high, but more predictable. You don't necessarily want to be in this position where you're starting backups, but there are going to be backups who go in and either because they're bad and the team has a lot of garbage time, or they do have some hybrid ability. Some of the teams are looking for that out of some of their backups. You will get some points that count. And even that, if your team is good enough, will allow you to get through to the next sort of level. So you have to be really grinding waivers in managed leagues as well.
Yeah, the floor is still high on any starting quarterback, like relative to other positions. I am curious about how this dynamic we're seeing in redraft, where we've seen 2 years in a row now, basically the quarterbacks that are drafted in the top 12 or so. I don't know the exact cutoff, but these quarterbacks are separating from the field a little bit more, and they're doing it in a more predictable manner. There was a tweet from Chris Towers where he noted, if you look at the last two, of course, now I can't find the tweet, Shawn, just poor prep here. Okay, here's what it was. From 2016 to 2019, this was from Chris Towers of CBS, quarterbacks drafted outside of the top 12 in positional ADP accounted for 53% of top 6 weekly finishes. So you could still get a pretty, good ceiling performances here and there out of these players. The last 2 seasons, 2020 and 2021, that dropped to 33%. That's a really significant drop off. And I'm looking at our rankings at ETR, and there's a point at which it certainly seems like that's going to happen again, where there's a drop off, and it's just hard to see quarterbacks matching the ceiling. It's just a different game with the rushing ability of the top quarterbacks, or offenses like Kansas City and Tampa Bay. They're going to score so much and are willing to have a really high pass rate over expectation, so their pass attempts aren't muted. Like in the past, sometimes we'd really see an offset between efficiency and volume in terms of passing. We don't see that offset to kind of even out the players. So I'm curious how that impacts Dynasty for you. I think that short term, at least, that's going to continue into this season, where there's just a clear separation. And, even in best ball, like any collection of like Matt Ryan and Carson Wentz can't match a 30-point Lamar Jackson game. You can't, I said earlier, with patchwork, making up for quality with quantity to a certain extent, you can't do that as much at the quarterback position, potentially by being stronger in other areas you could.
And especially in the shorter starting lineup formats, you're not going to be able to compete with those types of teams. One of the things that I love about the emergence of best ball and now having this split between dynasty and best ball and redraft and having so many teams in the different formats is that I think you can really manage your risk in some ways and manage your portfolio by playing the formats in the ways that really work for them. And that also gets you on some different players. And so there's the portfolio element there. One of the things that our best ball tools have always shown very strongly, and Mike Beer is obviously the best ball guru, is that the QB window is real. You need to have 2 QBs in the window. It does come from that, QB1. Well, it's not really the top handful of guys. They're too expensive. But you go beyond just that first little group, and then it extends to QB 16 to QB 18-ish, which sort of corresponds with what you were saying there. One of the things we've also seen is that QB window has crept up over the last couple of years for the very reason that you're talking about, in that there's a stronger relationship between QB ADP and QB scoring. And so I always have 2 QBs in the window in best ball. I like to play it more aggressively or more, I don't know if risky is really the right way. One of the things I think that always caused a problem with zero RB is people didn't look at risk in the right way. So you're taking certain kinds of risk by passing on the top quarterbacks. You're balancing your risk out or diversifying in a way that actually mitigates the risk overall when you go for some of these other QBs. I also like to take the shot in Dynasty that players will emerge over time and really focus on the trade value aspect of it, to where in a 2022 league still, I don't think that you're that excited about Mac Jones or Zach Wilson. But in Dynasty, you have this element where they're young And if you drafted them last year, in part because they didn't have that hybrid ability, at least in the same way, you got great prices on them. And yet, because they're young QBs, that one, Mac Jones actually was very, very good. And then two, Zach Wilson now has got the good fortune of them adding some weapons around him that have really given him both a floor and a ceiling, at least in terms of price, in terms of trade value. If you made the move on those guys, you didn't necessarily have to even be right, certainly from the Wilson perspective, to have realized some trade value gains. Now, if you're thinking you had to win last year, I mean, last year was definitely a win now or win right away type of approach, and you spent those picks and you didn't have something else to balance it out, then maybe that's not as appealing. But if you're looking at it from the longer term dynasty perspective, there are so many things you can do with young QBs and high risk QBs, sort of contingency based QBs, to where you can win either way. Because if you're wrong, you can get out of them with minimal loss. If you're right, then you realize this huge win that you didn't really pay for, and now you have this dominating team. It'll be interesting with this idea of, does this redraft element continue, and which young quarterbacks might it apply to? The thing that we've always seen, and the reason why you're going to get quarterback values from all over the place, was exactly what you mentioned in terms of this trade-off between efficiency and volume. I think that we're going to still have some really good late-round QB seasons over the next 5 to 10 years from guys who have just enough talent to benefit from garbage time. You're going to have those types of seasons mixed in. I think you want to have exposure to those types of players. That's a little bit more of a thing where you're going out and saying, I think I can pick guys. And I still like that element of it where, you're a superstar with your projections. I mean, you're saying, I think I can get these guys right in my projections and my rankings. You want to be on the players that you think are actually going to beat the market. So I think you can do that. The flip side of it is that I'm excited to see what will happen, because the element that you mentioned where some of these teams have realized that the pass rates are too low. If you have stars, you want to keep passing. That part of it is really cool. You hope that they don't do what the Green Bay Packers do, where they're so slow to the line of scrimmage. They don't run a lot of plays, and they're taking away some of their opportunity to blow people out and not let the games be close. On the other side of it, we've seen teams in the past that were bad actually try and compete and be very aggressive, play fast and loose from behind. You get those interceptions, which then just means that you have to throw more as you go into the third and fourth quarters. Well, we also have a handful of teams that maybe don't have that type of quarterback, but they have a very good team. So, what do? You want to limit the number of plays that your quarterback can mess up and allow the other things that you're going to do well. And so if you're a good team, or frankly, if you're a bad team, I mean, you definitely want to limit the number of plays, because then the variance is going to come into play on your behalf. And so from that perspective, we could see teams with weaker quarterbacks try and limit plays as opposed to benefit from garbage time. If we do that, then we're going to have this continued separation between the guys who score and the guys who don't.
Yeah, and I had perhaps Silva wrote an article last year called Late Round Quarterback is Back. Did not age well, but my point there was attempting to note that there's going to be more players like Trey Lance coming in the league that have some upside. Of course, he didn't hit. The rookie quarterback's not hitting in general. Lance and Fields really kind of made that look bad, but the idea behind that is we'll get guys like Lance and Fields. Like the quarterbacks that are coming in are going to have more of a fantasy profile that we like. And there's also maybe going to be more teams like, Cincinnati ended up getting there just on pure efficiency with Burrow, but there's going to be talented quarterbacks that hopefully their teams lean into the pass game a little bit more. And we're going to start to see that make up a higher proportion of teams than we see now. And I still think that might happen long-term. It just short-term, it really didn't happen. And even like Lance and Fields now they're being drafted in the top 15 quarterbacks in redrafts. So even if we think it happens for them, it doesn't necessarily make late round quarterback back. So I wonder if that happens over time. I know next year, I'm not real in the weeds with prospect stuff, but we're supposed to get 3 or 4 quarterbacks that are going to be drafted in the first round of rookie drafts. We do have, as you noted, guys that if they play from this year's rookie class are going to produce from a fantasy perspective, particularly Malik Willis, Matt Corral, Desmond Ritter. If those guys get in, they're going to produce. And that's interesting to me. The one late round quarterback I like in both Dynasty and redraft. He has a ton of risk in Dynasty, but because of this, he's really, really cheap, though, is Daniel Jones, where he's got the rushing element. And I've been really into this season buying into the plus EV, coaching changes, plus EV quarterback changes for the wide receivers. And with Daniel Jones getting Brian Dable, I think there's enough uncertainty there on both ends that it could be really good and he could have a huge profit. So are there who are some of the quarterbacks that you like a bit later that you think, could pay off?
Daniel Jones is the very clear one where his price just seems crazy because he could still be relatively bad and be a good fantasy quarterback. And I'm always looking for opportunities within all formats and all types of drafts to be able to select players that at their price, they could actually not even be that good and really have room to beat by a significant margin. One of the things with him is that if in fact he is good, then not only do you win now, but you're going to have this immense value over time.
Huge profit.
Immense value. I don't think the rest of the guys that I have put together for this really make it nearly to that point. But Ryan Tannehill is someone who, he wasn't unbelievable last season, and there were some schedule-based things and other things that allowed them to get to that playoff seed. But he wasn't working with a lot. He's been a good quarterback there. This one probably is just being a little bit of a Detroit Lions homer. But I think that with what Jared Goff actually did with the Rams, you go and you look at Matthew Stafford, who is one of the biggest arm talents in the last 15 years and has an amazing team around him. Yeah, he's better than Jared Goff, and the Rams won the Super Bowl, and it makes Goff look even worse. But some of the things that Goff did with the Rams were actually pretty impressive. He had a little bit of a decent run at the end of last season, and he's got weapons, right? You're talking about, we still don't and one of the things is that there's a lot of uncertainty with all three of these guys. DJ Chark may be more or less done, even though he's not that old. And he's a freak athlete who in his second year had a very nice season, someone who could be an impact player. Amon-Ra has that run at the end of last year. Didn't have a lot of target competition, a little bit fluky based on his profile coming in. Maybe that's a mirage. Jameson Williams, we don't know, when he's going to be healthy, what he's going to come back as, what his 1 year at Alabama necessarily indicated. But all three of those guys could be very, very good. TJ Hawkinson is a stud. DeAndre Swift is a stud. You're surrounded by all of these guys who can get the job done for it. And I don't think all of those guys have to actually be as good as I think that they are. So I think that there's some value there. And one of the things too is that, yeah, he probably doesn't have a lot of time left as a starter, but if he would come out and have a big season for Detroit, even if they decide to go in a different situation, Detroit is actually one of these teams that's rebuilding and looks like they could be a long-time Super Bowl contender, not this year and not next year, but after that. Just a lot of things going right, I think, for them. But he's going to have a chance for these other teams. You've got teams right now, like the Seattle Seahawks, who somehow think that Drew Lock could be an answer. There are going to be teams that think you can be an answer when you've done some of the things that Jared Goff has both done and I think could do. Marcus Mariota, I think, has the perfect profile. I love him, love the character. It does seem like he's going to be beaten out by Desmond Ritter pretty fast. But again, from a cost perspective on how you're looking at these QBs and where they're being drafted, Ritter as well is someone that you have to be all over. And then even though I think that he has a lot of problems and isn't going to be a superstar, doesn't look like he's going to be a starter this year, but Baker Mayfield is someone that you should still be drafting. The price there is, again, just kind of absurd.
There's guys like Baker where it's like, they're going to get a shot at some point, and the second they do, their value is immediately more than it is right now. There's guys like that in best ball, like Will Fuller and even Julio Jones, that, they're free and where they could sign in a bad spot and their ADP at worst is stagnant. So I think those guys make a lot of sense. I'm a little bit on the Jared Goff train. I wasn't at all last year. Miko liked him going into last year. I wasn't buying this Dan Campbell version of the Lions. I can't believe they're a team we're looking at as kind of a fun, exciting upside offense. But Levitan got me to put 10-1 on him to win the division. So We're buying the Lions' love here at ETR. One final thing I want to ask you about before getting a couple questions from our subscribers in Discord have for you is that trade market for the quarterback can be difficult at times. You touched on it a little bit. And I think part of what makes that difficult is teams they get their 2 to 3 quarterbacks and then they kind of can have a tendency to stand pat. And as a result, it's difficult for them to trade because they need their 2 to 3 quarterbacks. So it's hard to trade one without getting one back. So how do you go about the trade market at the quarterback position where it can be very difficult? And how willing are you to continue to build up depth at quarterback, even if it seems excess, at the time, like a surplus, not something that you necessarily need, so that you can engage in these talks in the trade market?
It's really hard to have excess unless you're in a league that doesn't actually have very many roster spots. And even then, it is kind of tricky. You mentioned that SuperFlex QB trades are unique for the exact reason that you said, which is that regardless of what else is going on, in order to get a QB back, if you want to move for one of those top 6 guys, you have to have someone to sell, even if it's almost like a throw-in, because the other manager simply can't go down on their total number of QBs. Yeah. That's both good and bad. It's the reason why you do want to have as many of those guys in that 20 to 32 range, even though you prefer not to start them. And then if you're going to move somebody and maybe move someone in a way that isn't that smart, make sure you do get a QB back. We had a trade recently, Monty Fawn and I, in the Triflex, where we had built this team that, not surprisingly, I think for me, had a ton of wide receivers, a ton of tight ends. As the rookie draft had gone and we had all of these picks, we end up with a ton of quarterbacks. And our 2 running backs are Henderson and Singletary. And I like those guys, but you're probably not thinking to yourself, well, we're the favorites if those are the only 2 running backs on your roster. And so we moved Joe Burrow for Jonathan Taylor, which is difficult from the perspective of how long we would expect those guys to play. But Taylor puts us in a situation where now we have the best starting lineup in the league because we have other QBs, and Jameis Winston comes back as part of some of the other things that happen in that deal. Now, Winston isn't somebody that I'm interested in myself, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to move him to a different manager. But I think that with these SuperFlex QB trades, you have to be confident in and at least willing to continue to consider the fact that this isn't the first trade. This is just a piece kind of in this overall ladder or plan where then this guy moves somewhere else. You have to be willing to take back players that maybe in a different format you wouldn't take back, but you know that these QBs are very liquid if you have them. If you don't have them, and one of the other things that we talk about how, in the startup, the QBs are expensive, but maybe sometimes you can risk it and try and hit, QB 19 and 20. That's outside the QB window for redraft, but because the youth is valuable in Dynasty, maybe you're hitting those guys, but you can't get caught completely, because one of the things that's going to happen is regardless of what the prices were in the startup, as soon as the startup ends, all of those guys jump in price again because trades are complicated and you're not going to be able to make moves. So if you have them on your roster, it's a great way to get all kinds of deals done. If you don't, you're going to have to work through some things and you're going to have some limitations simply because other managers want a big price if they're going to give you even someone who's bad. Some of the deals that I saw for Drew Lock and Jared Goff this offseason were mind-boggling. So I'm like, these guys aren't even necessarily sure to start. Now, Goff at this point is, but pre-draft, you know that, and you're like, I need to have a lot of QBs because I can make some of these trades myself.
Yeah, I do like the takeaways of the QB window being a little bit bigger because of the value of youth and just longevity. Keep some of those guys propped up, even if they don't have that elite upside that you're missing out on in redraft. And you saying to make sure you get a quarterback back. I think to the end of last year, Pat Crane and I were in a league and we made sure to get Mitch Trubisky back as a throw-in in a trade. And, there was a point in time where we traded him this offseason and he had some value. Marcus Mariota would have been another guy last year, just get that guy back and sort of the asymmetric upside. You're almost paying nothing for him. If it's part of a larger deal, get him as a throw-in and you might have a pretty good sell window. Looking at some of the user questions, one dealing with trades, Henry De Los Reyes asked, I've heard Shawn talk about how he likes to engage a potential trade partner in dialogue. I struggle with this and typically send cold offers that I think make sense because I feel like I'm coming across as disingenuous when I include comments. What are some tips for how you engage potential trade partners? For example, are there any specific go-to phrases or questions you include in an initial offer?
Yeah, that element of whether or not you actually are being disingenuous, just the appearance of it when you send comments trying to sell the opposing manager on your guy. I mean, they're going to read that and be like, if that's true, why are you moving him? Yeah. I think the comments that can work from time to time are comments where you explain why you thought it was a fit as opposed to why the opposing manager should be maybe higher on this guy than market or even at market. Because one of the reasons you have the player on your team in the first place in most cases is that you were a little bit higher than the market at that point in time. That's how you have them and not the other 11 players. The other thing that you can do is send these trade offers out cold the first time as opposed to trying to sell. And then if you get counters, you're going to go through and then start to work with that opposing manager. And one of the things that I really try and emphasize is this idea of being honest with them about what your objectives are and trying to help them accomplish their objectives. So when you're having this dialogue, you're trying to figure out what they need, what they want, what they're trying to get done, and you're being honest about what you're trying to get done and how you value the players. I mean, one of the worst things that you can do is tell someone, okay, you should accept this trade because it's even in this trade calculator. Or you should accept this trade because it's even in certain people's rankings. The two people involved in the trade don't have those rankings in all likelihood, right? You have your own rankings. You're probably higher than the market. And you need to be honest about the fact that if you're going to move this player to someone else, they also need to be higher than the market. Now, maybe that actually ends up being a wash because they've got a guy they want to send back to you that they're higher than the market on, and they need you to be higher than the market. And then it just evens out. But you have to work with the value that manager has. And so you have to be fair and open about it. And one of the things that I just say to try and diffuse that is like, this is what my value is. I realize that that's higher than the market, so that when the person I'm working with makes an offer and I counter or I reject, that they understand that I'm not trying to like pull one over on them. I'm not trying to get them to pay more than the market because I want to win the trade. I want them to pay this particular price because that's where the value is for me. And if you can work through that with them, I think that helps. The other thing too is just to be very good about responding to trade offers. You'll get, most of the trade offers you get are not auto accepts. And if you do get an auto accept, you should do that as opposed to countering. You don't want to be the person who blows everything up and ruins your reputation because someone gives you an unbalanced trade offer in your favor. And then you're like, well, how about a second round pick in addition?
Yeah, absolutely.
But when you get these offers, then you know who they wanted on your team and you know who they're willing to give up. So then you send back an offer that reflects what your price is for the person they wanted, and also send an offer for the guy they offered to show you what you're willing to pay for that person, even though the two people involved in the original offer, were not a fit. And so that information really helps both parties. It doesn't mean a trade will get done because a lot of times you're just still not at the same place. But that kind of interaction of ideas and exchange of information can be very valuable as you go forward. And then I think as you sort of establish yourself as someone who wants to create a trade that's a win-win for the two people involved and a loss for the other 10 members who weren't involved in it, then you tend to get a lot of good offers. And when you send an offer that maybe the other person didn't like, because we all have situations where actually we thought it was a pretty good offer. You send it out and the person's like, well, I have both of my players higher than both of your players. Why did you send this? And you're like, well, you're not going to send that person another offer in all likelihood anytime soon because they didn't respond in a way that you appreciate. You're like, I thought it was okay. Right. So you always want to make sure that those interactions are positive because the benefits as you go forward are really pretty significant.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Skeletor 0901 asks, he recently had a SuperFlex Titan Premium startup, was his first one, and he was wondering about drafting 2 potential breakout quarterbacks instead of 1 unproven quarterback, 1 veteran. So he ended up with only Zach Wilson and Trey Lance. So a lot of upside there, but certainly some risk there. And is curious if he should have taken maybe a vet like Kirk Cousins instead of Zach Wilson to pair with Trey Lance. And I actually have a team I'm curious that's similar sort of mindset. It's Rotoviz Triflex. Again, I sort of punted quarterback like I did that one league. I ended up with Zach Wilson, Kenny Pickett, and Daniel Jones as my only 3. And that goes back to something you were saying about kind of mixing your profiles at quarterback. I didn't really do that. Skeletor didn't necessarily do that. Do you think that's okay for a startup to come out with, risky but high upside quarterbacks like Trey Lance and Zach Wilson without any sort of more secure backstop?
This will probably require you to have sort of a full reloading type of team. It would require you, I think, to have a team where you were flexible in how you finished the next year, because there is a lot of risk that neither one of those guys hit. I think especially Wilson, even though Lance wasn't good enough to play at all last year, or circumstances led to that effect. You want to be able to benefit from the fact that if you miss, that you have a top 2 or 3 pick, and you can do some different things, whether it's drafting a quarterback, trading back, drafting a superstar at a different position, and then moving some of your other depth for QBs. You want to have different pathways to kind of overcome those misses. One of the things with these young QBs and young players at a variety of positions is that it's not quite as beneficial after year 2, because if you bust year 2, then your trade value is going to fall. People are not as excited about you then. I mean, that first year you get a lot of excuses, or you just, you get the rope to go out there and learn. Not all stars are stars in that first year. The year 2 leap and the year 2 breakout effect is very, very real. It happens across the positions. And so if you get a price that puts you in a position that you can benefit from that, I think you want to have exposure to it. You definitely want to have a ton of exposure to it in redraft, where you're not sitting with the mistakes for multiple years in the future. But you have to understand that when you do miss on those guys, then the trade value falls through the floor. So especially in a dynasty perspective, I think that it almost makes sense to keep trying to move the risk to the rookies, to where when they miss, you can just move off of them, and or you have that second year with them. The second year players, it can work both ways, because the upside is extremely high. And then I think it depends sort of on the price. One of the things that is implied with this question is that the prices on these guys are pretty good. And so then the year 2 breakout, I think, is an encouraging element of it. I think you want to be ready to quickly move for movements in price with those types of players as well. If you have a big first month and you can get these massive trade packages back, you can use some of those types of things to, again, spread out your risk. If you have a bad first month and people are still kind of believing, maybe again, make a move even if you have to sell at a loss, because managing the trade value of your top pieces in Dynasty is very, very important. If you let yourself get hit on too many of them, then you're playing way from behind.
Yeah, Zach Wilson's an interesting guy where I almost like him as an upside gamble, but on win now teams, because I feel like a lot of his value is I know he's going to start this year. Dink and I were in this league where we basically went hero quarterback. We took Dak Prescott at 11, but we ended up trading our second round pick to get some future firsts, and not expecting to compete at this year. Maybe if it does, happy accident. And Zach Wilson kept falling. And we were like, we really didn't want to take on that risk on a team we didn't think would compete, and we're not putting those points to good use this year, which is kind of weird for a young quarterback. You'd think it would make sense for a rebuild type team, but I felt like the risk reward had shifted when I'm not being able to put this year's points to use at all. A question from Derek Carr, which should be near and dear to your heart, Shawn, as a Derek Carr fan. He wants to know, did you ever ponder that your 0 RB article, your initial one that you wrote on Rotoviz, would be as popular as it is today?
Probably not, right? But
yeah.
it was this weird situation where I was surprised at the time and then surprised at different points in the future that despite all of the attention that it got, that it didn't penetrate
mainstream.
In a way where
maybe mainstream is the wrong word, but the certain types of drafters were pretty dismissive of it, I guess, in certain specific
and I'm
context.
certainly okay with all of that. I mean, one of the things that you always look at when you're someone who, and obviously I know that you obviously are a big time player in a lot of different formats, is where is this kind of balance between the analyst side and the performance side, where you're actually playing and wanting to win big money, and you have some of the pieces in place to do that. Do you give up all of these edges and over time see some of those? I mean, they're big loopholes in some cases. Those close up. And so you have to do some different things. And one of the things that I've been doing quite a bit this season is drafting hyper fragile teams, because I think that some of the dynamics in the first 5 rounds are actually very favorable, specifically in 2022 for that. And in part just because I don't want to be, number one, you never want to be dogmatic, but also you want some variety, right? You don't want to go out and draft a 0 RB team every time. But one of the things that was odd was that I knew from experience that 0 RB was an incredibly successful way to play. And that part of it has become the element, I think, that has joined the mainstream within the last couple of years. It's not the only way to play. There are some other methods that are also very good, perhaps dominant. But kind of with that background and then with the attention that the article got, and one of the reasons why I think it got attention was that I was kind of struggling with this idea of how do I convey the idea. And I think that, whether or not you believe that some of these principles work within games as opposed to out in the wider world, this idea of fragile, robust, and anti-fragile at least did kind of get across some of the elements of why these teams work. And it appealed to people, and it got attention in some, and sometimes, and in some cases more attention than maybe I was desiring. And yet the thing that was a little bit odd is that I really think that there was a decent chunk of people out there who thought it was clickbait and who thought it was just trying to generate controversy and, get traffic and get subscriptions. And
that's funny because I know my reaction when I first read that article was kind of like, holy shit, this is awesome. Not necessarily the strategy itself, but again, going to the anti-fragile, robust, fragility, utilizing those concepts in such an interesting, contrarian way that no one, I just would have never thought to do something like that myself. And I really felt like it opened up a new avenue in my brain for how to think, about fantasy, to stop thinking so, I guess, linear across it, and probably not articulating this quite the way I want to, but it was a great article, Shawn. It definitely inspired a lot of how I think about fantasy. So definitely wanted to get that question in.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And this is going to sound like it's going to sound because I'm on your show and all that kind of thing, but it means a lot to me, you saying that. There aren't many people in the fantasy industry that I have more respect for the way they think and what they do than you. And so I really appreciate that compliment. That means a lot to me.
Thank you. I appreciate that as well. Although I should note that I did put that in the show notes that Shawn had to say that. It's at the very bottom. So it was required. Okay. Very last thing before I let you go. Is Juju Smith-Schuster going to smash this year?
Whew. Let's say yes. Right? It's got to be.
Let's go. I'm out on a limb on him right as of right now. I think more so than any other player, and I feel really good about the upside component, but I am terrified of it going badly at the same time.
Well, I've always felt there's never a bad time to draft Hakeem Nicks or Kenny Britt. So, well, we can just
What could go wrong?
Fast forward to 2022 and get as many Juju shares as possible.
Awesome. Love it. Make sure you check out Shawn's work over at RotoViz, him and Ben Gretsch. And Ben will be joining me again this year for our off-season projections podcast series that we did last year. You can find them on Stealing Bananas. Can look it up on iTunes. Thanks so much, Shawn. Anything you want to let the people know with what you got going on with Ben or with RotoViz?
Well, you have been on RotoViz Overtime with Colin Kelly and myself several times. Those shows were excellent. Anybody who hasn't checked them out, make sure you do that. We're having a good time over at Stealing Bananas. The stuff on the site has been fantastic. Anthony Shook kind of followed in Mike Beer's footsteps and put together a fantastic underdog set of tools, the Explorer, the Advanced Rate, all of that. Michael Dubner, Connor O'Driscoll, and the whole gang are just doing content that blows me away on a daily basis. So I appreciate the chance to work with them. I appreciate the chance to come on here with you. And I mean, 2022 is the summer of fantasy football.
Awesome. Thanks, Shawn.